Learn.ba.
In this video, I want to talk about a term that gets used a lot in the BA profession, and that term is requirements gathering. And I want to talk a little bit about why I don't like that term and what it is that I think people should start to call the actual activity that it is. And I think that instead of calling it requirements gathering, it's a lot more appropriate to call it requirements discovery, or even if you were to call it something along the lines of requirements mining. And it might seem like a little bit nitpicky to say that, it's just all terminology, it's all just semantics. But for a new business analyst, it actually has a real impact. It makes a real difference on what it is that you call things, because for new analysts, one of the key things that they look for in language is some idea of what it is that the activity should contain. So, for example, if we call the activity that we perform as analyst requirements gathering, a new analyst might be left with the impression that there's a bunch of requirements just laying around waiting to be picked up, right? And so all they have to do is they just have to go and gather the requirements. It does very little justice to what that activity actually is. And if we continue to call it requirements gathering, what it does is that term takes away the full weight of what that activity should actually be, because it's a lot more involved than just speaking to somebody and asking them what it is that they want out of the solution. So the main reason I think we should get rid of it is because it implies to people that requirements are just hanging around and all we have to do is gather them. And the key point that you want to understand there is that your job as an analyst is not to go around gathering requirements. Your job as an analyst is to determine the real business need. Okay, I'm going to say it again. Your job as an analyst is to determine the real business need. And you're not going to get to be able to figure out what the real business need is if you just ask people. Because if you ask somebody what it is that the solution should look like, let's say you go to your client or you go to the user and you say, hey, what should this be? And that's the only question that you're asking. Instead of the person telling you what the real business need is, there's a huge risk that they're just going to tell you what it is that they want, right? And no judgment on them for doing that, because they themselves might not necessarily know. And in a lot of cases, they don't actually know what the real business need is. A lot of times when you're speaking to somebody who's at the operational level, they understand a lot of the pain points, but they understand the pain points from their own perspective. Your job as an analyst is to, again, determine the real business need. And the real business need isn't necessarily something that works well for just one actor in your process or one small group inside your company, right? The real business need is you understanding the full picture of what all the different pain points are, and then you making a judgment call on what the solution should look like based on what you understand. Okay, so like I said, this might seem like it's a little bit nitpicky, right? It might seem like I'm just picking on the language, but the language is a very important component because it implies what it is that we're actually responsible for. There are some analysts out there who believe that their job is to just listen to the user and listen to the client and to write things down and then to basically communicate that over to IT and job done, right? That is not what an analyst does. That is, in my worldview of business analysis, that I would describe that as a scribe, right? The job of a scribe is to listen very carefully at what it is that somebody says and to write it down and then to make sure that it gets communicated when it needs to be, right? That there's no real analysis that's being performed there, right? Because the scribe is not taking it upon themselves to do any kind of translation or to give any kind of input from their own experience into what goes into what it is that they're writing. So there's a huge difference. There's a huge difference between writing something down and communicating it, and there is a massive difference between what we call requirements gathering and what we call requirements discovery. Okay, so I want to encourage everybody to start calling it requirements discovery, because it tells everybody how much work is actually involved. When you're on an expedition and you're trying to discover something, you're not just walking around picking berries off of an open field, right? You're on a mission, and that mission isn't very easy, because there are going to be instances where you have to disagree very strongly with your own client. Now, disagreeing with your client is something that can be very difficult for some people to do, because after all, it is the client that's funding the project, right? It's the client that is making sure all of the resources are available so that you actually can perform that task. And so if you're looking at it strictly from that point of view, and you're thinking to yourself, well, how can I say to somebody that is that senior that I disagree with them? If you're in that mindset right now, I'm going to recommend that you go on to the blog at learn.va and that you read an article that I've written, because as an analyst, there are ways that you can effectively disagree with anybody in the company, regardless of their rank, regardless of their status, regardless of what level they are at in your organization. It's part of your job to be able to do that and to be able to push back effectively, as long as you have a good basis for doing so. And the way in which you disagree with your client, the terminology behind it is called disagree but commit, right? Disagree but commit, or disagree and commit, which means that essentially what you do is that if you have a very strong point of view on something, you disagree when it's time to have the conversation. But after the decision is made, regardless of whether the decision went your way or not, it is your professional obligation to implement based on the decision that's been made, right? So you want to make sure that you have the ability to give a very effective pushback. Otherwise, the client themselves may not necessarily see you as somebody who's effective at the job, because if all you're doing is just saying yes to everything that they ask for, you're providing no meaningful input. Okay, so requirements discovery means that you're going to have to disagree with your client. Okay, requirements gathering means that you just ask them what they want, you write it down, and you transfer that to the people who need to see it. The second difference between the two is the concept of requirement sources. Okay, so as you're going throughout your project, there are going to be a lot of people who are going to make assumptions about what the scope of your project is. And it's only usually going to be a subset of those people who are considered to be legitimate sources of requirements, which means that based on the project scope, there is a limited number of people whose opinions or input need to be taken into account when you're determining requirements, right? This is more of a scope management technique than anything else, because what it helps you limit is the concept of what's called scope creep, right? So when you're determining the scope for a project, if you're not upfront about what the scope is, and you're not strict about holding onto that scope throughout the execution phase of the project, what can happen to your project is that the size of your project can completely balloon out of control, because you're not controlling the sources of your requirements. You're not saying that, look, here is what it is that we've been slated to do, and here are the people that have been identified to provide input into that process. And so it's not necessarily a hard and fast rule about who it is, but generally speaking, you have a very good idea on who it is that does provide input as a source of requirement and who else does not. So you can consult people who may not necessarily provide your requirements. Okay, so that's the other major big difference between gathering and discovery. The third major difference is the idea that you yourself have to become a source of requirements. Okay, especially if you're starting to consider yourself to be a more senior analyst, you yourself have to become a source of requirements. You go just from being a facilitator, right, an impartial facilitator who says, okay, I want to make sure all the conversations happen. That's still a big part of your job, but that's not necessarily enough at the senior level, because at the senior level, what the expectation is from many clients is that you have a lot of experience on how solutions are built, and the business doesn't necessarily have a lot of that, right? So, and I'll give you a couple of examples of that in a second, but you have a lot of experience that should be factoring in that the business is not going to think about until the solution's actually gone into production, or maybe even after that. They might be thinking to themselves, my goodness, we should have included X, Y, and Z, but we never thought about it because we've actually never been through a software project before. And in those instances, you as a senior, again, as a senior analyst, have to become a source of requirements. Let me give you a perfect example of what area of requirements this tends to happen a lot in. Normally, when you're speaking to a division or a business unit about what the requirements are, and you're trying to basically figure out exactly what it is that the business need is, one of the major blind spots that the business tends to have is in the administration portion of the solution. So a lot of times, if you're building, let's say, a finance systems process, let's say that handles requisitions, right? There will be plenty of people to give you input on what a requisition is, what kind of a workflow it should go through, what kind of an authorization process there should be for that requisition. But very few people are going to be able to proactively identify, let's say, a lot of the data types that have to exist before a requisition even gets created. Okay, and so if you don't have a lot of domain knowledge in that area, that's okay. The idea here is that a lot of times when you're building out solutions, there is almost always an administration component of the solution that the business typically does not think about until it's way too late. And as a senior analyst, if you try to go out there and you try to gather requirements and you're not becoming a source of requirements yourself, because you're not doing discovery and you're not providing that high level of service to your clients that they expect from a senior analyst, a lot of those requirements are going to get missed. And what's going to happen is that, excuse me, somebody just ran in front of my car here. What's going to happen here is that if you're not providing that level of service and you're not adding in yourself as a source of requirements, those requirements are going to get missed, and you're going to be close to going into production. And then from somewhere you'll hear, wait a second, how are we going to handle X? And if those types of comments, and projects have the ability to derail, let's say, a production go live end date, because if that's something that's being considered way too late in the project, hasn't been included right up front because nobody's thought of it, the requirements gathering didn't capture it, that's going to introduce a lot of risk that nobody has any visibility into the project. So quick recap: when you're handling requirements, try not to think of it as requirements gathering. Try to think of it as requirements discovery that is much more involved than just walking around and gathering requirements from this person and that person and that person, okay? And discovery means that you're going to have to disagree. If you think something is wrong and you have a very good case for it, you have to know how to disagree effectively, okay? Professionally and effectively. You have to be able to identify and control your sources of requirements, okay, for scope management. And over a longer period of time, you yourself have to start to become a source of requirements, okay, to make sure that your client and the project that you're working on avoids any last minute surprises, okay? That's what I wanted to get through in this video. Again, I would recommend that you go and read an article that is on the website at learn.ba that is called Disagree and Commit. I can't remember if it's Disagree and Commit or Disagree but Commit. It's Disagree and Commit. Go ahead and read that article and leave a comment and let me know whether you think that that's something that would work for you. And if not, very importantly, explain to me why it is that you think that that approach would not work for you. Because it's a very fundamental skill for you to have as you start to become more senior as an analyst.